took 9 years before but I began to play the nightclubs in and around Southern California.
He's worn the same low-slung hat and skin-tight jeans for 4 decades, and somehow neither has ever gone out of style. Dwight Yoakam turned 68 this year, and if you followed his career even loosely, you know he's never been the kind of artist who fits neatly into a box. He's a Kentucky-born honky-tonk revivalist who built his career in Los Angeles rock clubs instead of Nashville studios. He's a country traditionalist who collaborated with Beck. He's a platinum-selling singer who also happens to be a genuinely respected character actor. And along the way, he's been through 2 significant legal battles. One with the producer who helped define his sound, and one with a major record label over who actually owns his most important album. This is the story of how all of those threads fit together, and why, at 68, Dwight Yoakam is still one of the most singular figures in American music. Most country stars in the late 1970s were chasing Nashville. Dwight Yoakam went there first, and it didn't work. In 1976, still in his early 20s, he made the trip to Music City, hoping to break in, only to find an industry that had little interest in what he was selling. Nashville at the time was built around songwriters and studio polish, not raw live performance, and Yoakam's instincts ran in the opposite direction. He wasn't interested in smoothing off his edges to fit a Music Row formula. So he did something unusual. He left. Yoakam relocated to Southern California, a region that, on paper, had no business becoming a country music hotbed. But Los Angeles had something Nashville didn't offer him. A scene of rock clubs and punk venues where a hillbilly singer with a sharp attitude could actually get booked. Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, Yoakam built a following the hard way, playing 5 sets a night in bars where fights sometimes broke out and where the crowd wasn't there for country music at all. He leaned into the Bakersfield sound, the twangy, guitar-driven style associated with Buck Owens and Merle Haggard, at a moment when mainstream country was drifting toward the polished, urban cowboy aesthetic. It was a deliberate act of stubbornness, and it very nearly kept him out of the industry entirely. What it also did was forge an identity. By the time Yoakam finally got a record deal, he wasn't a green artist trying to figure out who he was in front of an audience. He'd already spent years converting skeptical crowds one song at a time, and that toughness became the foundation of everything that followed. In 1986, Yoakam released his debut album, Guitars, Cadillacs, etc., etc., produced with his longtime collaborator Pete Anderson. It landed like a jolt of electricity into a genre that had been drifting further and further from its roots. The lead single, a cover of Johnny Horton's Honky Tonk Man, introduced Yoakam's voice to a national audience, but it was the title track that became his signature, a song built on sharp guitar work, lonesome lyrics, and an unmistakable swagger. The album eventually went double platinum, and critics who had been mourning the disappearance of country's rougher edges suddenly had a new reference point. Yoakam wasn't nostalgic for tradition. He was using it as a weapon. He and Anderson had built a sound that honored Bakersfield's honky-tonk roots while carrying the attitude of rock and roll, and it resonated with listeners who felt mainstream country had lost something essential. Almost overnight, Yoakam went from playing rowdy Los Angeles dive bars to selling out venues across the country. More importantly, he'd proven something to an industry that had once dismissed him. There was still an audience hungry for the real thing, delivered without compromise. The partnership between Yoakam and guitarist-producer Pete Anderson is one of the more significant creative pairings in modern country music. For nearly 20 years, the two worked together on album after album, with Anderson's guitar work and production sensibility becoming as central to the Yoakam sound as the singer's own voice. Records like Guitars, Cadillacs, etc., etc., and this time carried Anderson's fingerprints throughout, and the results earned Yoakam a reputation as a traditionalist with real rock and roll teeth. But long creative partnerships often carry hidden strain, and this one was no exception. By the early 2000s, tension had built up behind the scenes over business decisions and management direction. In 2004, that tension became public. Pete Anderson filed a lawsuit against Yoakam, alleging breach of contract tied to canceled concert obligations. Anderson claimed he had personally invested resources in preparing for shows that never happened, and that the cancellations had caused him real financial harm. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court, with the terms kept private. Neither side went into detail publicly, but the damage to their working relationship was clear and, as it turned out, permanent. The two never collaborated again in the same capacity. For Yoakam, the split marked a turning point. He took on a far more hands-on role in producing his own material afterward, which inevitably reshaped the sound audiences had come to associate with him. It wasn't necessarily a worse sound, just a different one, shaped by an artist now working without the collaborator who had helped define his career's first act. Nearly 2 decades after the split with Anderson, Yoakam found himself in a very different kind of legal fight, this time against Warner Music Group, one of the largest record labels in the world. In 2021, he filed suit over ownership rights to his early recordings, centered specifically on guitars, Cadillacs, etc., etc., the album that had launched his career. At the heart of the case was a provision in U.S. copyright law that allows artists to reclaim rights to their work after a set period, typically 35 years from the original release. Yoakam alleged that Warner had failed to properly honor the legal termination notices he'd filed, and that the label had continued distributing and profiting from his early recordings without his consent. It's a dispute that has become increasingly common in the music industry, as veteran artists from the 1970s, 80s, and 90s reached the point where they're legally entitled to take back control of masters that labels have owned for decades. Warner pushed back on procedural and contractual grounds, questioning the validity and timing of Yoakam's termination filings. The case never went to trial. In 2022, both sides reached a private settlement, and, much like the Anderson dispute, the terms were never made public. What is clear is that the case fit into a much larger pattern. Legacy artists increasingly pushing back against the industry structures that, for decades, kept ownership of an artist's most personal work in someone else's hands. Whatever the resolution actually contained, the fact that Yoakam pursued it at all says something about how seriously he takes control over his own legacy. If the Anderson years defined Yoakam's traditionalist foundation, his collaboration with Beck in the 2010s showed a very different side of him. The two worked together on Yoakam's 2012 album 3 Pairs, with Beck co-producing a pair of tracks, an unusual pairing on paper, joining a country traditionalist with one of alternative rock's most restless genre benders. The partnership pushed Yoakam somewhere he hadn't gone before. During the recording of A Heart Like Mine, Yoakam laid down a scratch take on electric guitar, an instrument he rarely took the lead on. Beck's instinct was to keep it exactly as it was, imperfections included. That moment became something of a turning point in how Yoakam approached the studio. Less concerned with polish, more focused on capturing something immediate and honest. It echoed the same instincts that had driven him decades earlier, playing raw sets in Los Angeles bars where the performance mattered more than the production. The Beck collaboration also introduced Yoakam's music to listeners who might never have found it otherwise. Indie and alt-rock audiences drawn in by Beck's involvement, many of whom stuck around once they heard what Yoakam was actually doing. Tracks from that era blended pedal steel with layered, unconventional arrangements, proof that Yoakam's commitment to authenticity didn't mean he was allergic to experimentation. If anything, the partnership reinforced something he believed from the start of his career, that staying true to yourself and pushing into new territory aren't opposites. Music has never been the only outlet for Yoakam's storytelling instincts. He dabbled in performance since school plays and community theater, long before he had a record deal, and that early interest eventually found its way into a genuinely substantial acting career. His breakout role came in 1996, when he played Doyle Hargraves, the abusive boyfriend at the center of Billy Bob Thornton's Sling Blade. It was a dark, unflinching performance, and it did something few expected. It made critics and audiences take Yoakam seriously as an actor, not just a musician moonlighting on camera. From there, his filmography grew steadily. A chilling, near-silent turn as a masked home intruder in David Fincher's Panic Room, supporting roles in The Newton Boys and Crank, a memorable comedic cameo in Wedding Crashers, and television appearances on shows like Under the Dome and Wilfred, where he played the eccentric Dr. Cahill. What's striking about Yoakam's acting career is the range within it. Menace in one film, comedy in another, quiet gravity in a third. He's spoken in interviews about seeing music and acting as two expressions of the same underlying instinct, finding the emotional truth in a character or a lyric and refusing to fake it. That philosophy is part of what made Sling Blade land the way it did, and it's part of why directors kept casting him in roles that required more than star power, roles that needed someone willing to disappear into a character. Not every creative risk pays off, and Yoakam's most ambitious filmmaking venture is a clear example. In 2000, he wrote, directed, starred in, produced, and scored South of Heaven, West of Hell, a Western drama with a cast that included Vince Vaughn, Bridget Fonda, and Billy Bob Thornton. It was a genuine passion project, and Yoakam poured everything he had into it, including, by most accounts, a significant amount of his own money after investors backed out during production. The film was not well received. Critics described it as disjointed and overstuffed, and it struggled to find an audience either in theaters or on home video. For an artist used to succeeding by trusting his instincts, it was a rare and costly miss, one that reportedly strained relationships within his own band and business circle at the time. Yoakam has rarely discussed the film's fallout publicly, but its legacy isn't really about failure. It's about the fact that he was willing to take the swing at all. Plenty of established musicians never risk a project that ambitious, precisely because of what happens when it doesn't work. Yoakam did it anyway, and the film remains a case study in the cost and the value of full creative control. Looking back across all of it, the LA bar circuit, the platinum breakthrough, the Anderson years, the Beck experiment, the acting career, the lawsuits, there's a through line that connects nearly everything Dwight Yoakam has done, a refusal to let anyone else define what he was supposed to be. Nashville didn't know what to do with him early on, and he simply built a career somewhere else. When his signature collaboration with Pete Anderson ended, he didn't retreat. He took the reins himself. When a major label allegedly failed to return rights that legally belonged to him, he fought for them in court rather than letting it go. When an alt-rock producer half his generational distance suggested he loosen up in the studio, he did it, and it worked. That same instinct extends to his acting choices, which have never been about chasing fame through film. He's gravitated toward complicated, uncomfortable characters, the kind that let him use the same emotional honesty that drives his songwriting. It's a consistent creative philosophy across two very different mediums, and it's part of why his work in both has aged well instead of feeling like a passing novelty. At 68, Yoakam shows little sign of slowing down. He continues to record and tour, and he's taken on a role as something of an elder statesman for traditional country and Bakersfield-style honky-tonk genres he helped keep alive at a moment when the mainstream had largely moved away from them. His SiriusXM program, Dwight Yoakam and the Bakersfield Beat, gives him a platform to spotlight the music and artists that shaped him, along with newer voices working in similar territory. He's also indicated ongoing interest in acting, and possibly in moving further behind the camera as a director or producer, a natural next step for someone who's already written, directed, and scored a feature film once before, mistakes and all. Streaming has introduced his catalog to listeners who weren't alive when guitars, Cadillacs, etc. came out, and that intergenerational reach says something about how well his music has held up. It wasn't built around a trend, so it never really went out of fashion. Yoakam's legacy isn't tied to a single moment or a single genre. It's the sum of a lot of individual decisions, to leave Nashville rather than compromise, to fight legally for ownership of his own work not once but twice, to say yes to a collaboration that made no obvious sense on paper, and to keep taking creative risks even after one of them cost him dearly. Whatever comes next for Dwight Yoakam, the pattern is well established by now. He'll do it his way, on his own terms, the same way he's done everything else since those